Our last speaker before lunch, and Mary-Jane Bennett, and she's what's between us and lunch. So Mary-Jane is a lawyer and began her career with the Department of Justice in Ontario. She had a litigation practice in Winnipeg before being appointed to the Canadian Transportation Agency as a board member in January '98. During her 10 years at the Canadian Transportation Agency, she was involved in a number of grain railway matters, including consultations under the revenue cap, the annual setting of the cap and level of service decisions. She is now a transportation consultant and senior research fellow with Frontier Center for Public Policy. She has written opinion articles for several Canadian dailies, including the National Post, Montreal Gazette, Calgary Herald, and Vancouver Sun. Mary-Jane, please.
I'll start with the simple premise that everyone in the room is well aware. Canadian grain needs to get to export, and as Murad Al-Khatib said, 94% of that movement is by rail. So there's a partnership, like it or not, and that rail-grain partnership has driven the Canadian economy. It's put Canada in the forefront in the global trade in wheat, and it's put Canada at the table in the commercial, monetary, and foreign policy making that followed. But for historical reasons, Canada chose to turn to regulation of both its wheat and rail industries, and an urgent need is present right now to assess whether rail regulation has benefited the grain industry. There's an alarming figure that needs to be tackled. In 1971, Canada's share of the world wheat market stood at 25% of quantity and 23% of value. Today, it's at half that, at about 11% quantity and 12% value. Agriculture must be restored, grain and agriculture must be restored to being a major player in the economy. Simple, say many around this room. All we have to do is add another layer of regulation. But first, let's examine how we got so regulated. A little over a century ago, the high protein content of Canadian wheat caused a marvel over in the United Kingdom. There was enthusiasm received by UK millers at this loaf of bread that rose so perfectly and maintained its shape so effortlessly. And their enthusiasm was matched by the Parliament in Canada, who said, well, we need some sort of copyright protection, setting up the Canada Grains Act in 1912. That act mandated grain grading, creating grain commissioners who had regulatory power to police, grade, enforce classifications. Like other regulation, there was a sensible purpose for it initially, and what it did in Canada here was it established Canada's reputation as a world-class exporter of grain. That lasted for the first half of the century. By 1980, the world trade in wheat had changed, and buyers were focusing more on the attributes and specifications. So, and now 80% of wheat trade is on that basis. So the footing has changed, and U.S. grain is now downgraded when it crosses the border to Canada, so a trade complaint is imminent. Similarly, add to that there's claims of improper grading to the detriment of farmers, and that's an issue that has to be dealt with. And similarly, grain grading is creating inefficiencies such through segregation, cleaning, and grading at port. So then we look at the wheat board. We all know the history of the wheat board, that it was initially a voluntary vehicle for grain delivery, and since 1943, when inflation was at 7.4%, the wheat board became the mandatory vehicle for grain delivery. So what's important to remember in all of this grain side of the equation is that the wheat board, grain grading, they've all been responsible for inefficiencies, practices, and subsidies and slowdowns, and rail is no different. Like grain, for its original purpose, the railway rate making made sense. It had subsidies for the building of the main line, and the land grants that went with it had to be repaid. But the so-called CRO rates, the restrictive railway rates that govern grain for the next 100 years or so, caused serious and irreversible problems. They were finally put to rest in 1983. By then, they'd done a lot of harm. The problem with rate-making regulation became evident, though, by the 1950s, when Canada, because of these slowdowns, was unable to deliver on its wheat commitments to the USSR and China. But nothing was done, decade after decade. Politics intervened, trumping economics. It's very easy to say one's standing up for farmers. The CRO rates not only caused a financial crisis with the railways, they stalled grain industry advances, such as rail cars, weigh scales, and elevators. They were all in poor shape. So with the railways on the verge of bankruptcy due to the rates, and the grain industry hauled into a terrible position because of it, the government intervened, called a royal commission, headed by prominent Saskatchewan progressive conservative Murdoch McPherson, and a very esteemed law firm in Regina continues his name to this day. The famous McPherson report urged the government to treat railways like any other business. In his words, they should be governed by ordinary business practices. But the recommendations to commercialize rail transportation were ignored, and Canada moved further and further and further into regulating the railways. Today, grain rates are regulated under the revenue cap. It's called the maximum revenue entitlement. The two words are interchangeable. I've always called it the revenue cap, so you'll excuse me if I continue to use that term. But rates under the revenue cap are below market, so you're getting a good deal for the grain. It's at 25% less than other commodities. But with that low rate comes the problem, and conditions are being created not unlike that in the 50s and 60s, when grain commitments to the USSR and China couldn't be, the commitments couldn't be honored. Yet, despite the crisis, and there is a crisis in grain transportation, the people around this room say the following: keep the revenue cap, which has not even kept pace with inflation. Tinker with it a bit, because we know that there's a problem with peak load pricing. Introduce running rights, which is basically state-ordered taking of rail's private property. And conduct, APA's recommendation is to conduct an intrusive review of railway spending, costs, purchases, how much, what they're going to do in the future. Also, farmers can get a cheaper rate. And as I say, rates are already below market. Railways are choked by the regulation. Rates are regulated, as is service. Let's look then at the, but if more regulation is needed, then let's look at the crop year 13-14 to see how more regulation worked. That year's crop, as we all know, was a bin buster at 76 million tons. It was fully 50% above average. It was, add to that, it was the coldest winter in a lifetime. And the railways were, to use the words of Claude Mongeau, CN's CEO, they were put on their knees. Now, some people say, well, the weather, you know, that's Canada, we get cold weather, but that's inaccurate because the law itself said the weather put the railways back. And I'm going to read right from the regulatory impact statement, which is part of the law itself. Beginning in December 2013, extreme cold temperature and winter conditions affected railway operations. That is, by reducing train lengths up to 30%. In addition, Western Canada's grain farmers produced a record crop As a consequence of the reduced railway operations, CN and CP were not able to fulfill shipper car orders, resulting in a backlog of grain. So now think about it. What you say is there's conditions beyond their control, so you pass a law telling them how much to carry. And I say it was an odd law and one that caused a lot of problems. Once rail again found itself, as there's a long history of this, as the target of politics. I say this because not only did the regulatory impact statement say this, there's some other factors pointing to it. First of all, the quota law was to take effect when the weather got better. Secondly, the railways, in their meetings with the minister, had promised to deliver roughly that same amount, but to maintain their commitments elsewhere. So what did the law do? It said, you better do a quick turnaround to Vancouver of huge volumes or you're going to be fined. As the result, the railways moved quickly, as they were told to do, chugging back and forth to Vancouver, and there were slower moves to the U.S. And movements that slowed to the U.S. impacted a number of industries. Let's look at fertilizer giant Agrium in Alberta. They claim a 43% decline in earnings because their movements were stalled to the U.S. Eastern Canadian mills couldn't get deliveries as the legislative focus was moving grain to export position at port, not to the eastern mills. Canadian oats suffered as well. Canadian agriculture should be very proud of the fact that 80% of oat production in the United States, Canada supplies millers in the United States with 80% of their required oats. So shipments to the United States dropped. Producer cars couldn't get their cars moving. Short lines were devastated by the minimum volumes as railways were forced to ignore or shed high-value markets with longer car cycle times. So to recap, Canadian growers, oat millers, grain processors, short lines, producer cars, they all lost, as did Canada's reputation. And all those that would have benefited from a lifting of the quota law were shuttled aside as politics intervened. Politically motivated laws lead to poor policy. The winter came and went, and the claim of carryover and loss was felt to be behind all of this was not met. In fact, by the fall, the carryover was at about normal at 12%. Month after month, however, that figure was repeated. There's another figure that grows or shrinks depending on the month, and those are the figures of Dr. Richard Gray. The loss to farmers varies widely. It's 3.1 billion, 4 billion, or 5 billion, depending on the report. Now, I'm a lawyer, I'm not an economist, but I know that if I went to court with a variation of that magnitude, well, let's just say it wouldn't end well. Gray's figures use FOB Vancouver and as the best market for wheat, but farmers make their sale at the Minneapolis or Kansas exchange with tonnages almost always hedged. Calculation of farm loss is difficult. First, the farmer's given up ownership. The mandatory annual port charges vary, as do the rail rates depending on what car lot you're using. Inland charges are equally variable depending on volume, annual handlings, destination choice, and quality. Then there's hedging, because the buying company will always hedge to avoid risk. So, and then the last of the matter is there's blending, because the next year, a crop of much smaller than the previous 13-14 crop was much smaller and poorer quality and allowed for great blending opportunities. So that winter is over, and what lessons did we learn? Well, we learned that there's major problems in the supply chain. And as Murad Al-Khatib has pointed out, it's called a chain because there's links to it. And while the government maintained its focus on the railways, it overlooked the fact that new fixes are needed at ports, and there's a lack of waterfront storage capacity. It ignored the fact that the wheat board used to have a leveling effect. It was called orderly marketing of grain for that very reason. It ignored the fact that the U.S. has 40% more terminal capacity at port, and grain companies are trying to position themselves and want the railways to move faster. It ignored the fact that grain companies didn't order earlier and then brought in ships too fast. Quorum itself acknowledged this, that the low demurrage charges had grain companies bringing in the ships too fast. It ignored the fact that elevators may be holding on to the grain to maximize prices, and that grain companies always will overorder cars to jockey for position. The American system is commercial. You don't have that happening. So let's just recap on the 13-14 crop year to see how government regulation worked for you. It didn't move more grain. It distorted the market as producer cars, short lines, U.S. and Eastern movements suffered. It caused severe interruptions to many industry. It gave out signals to international buyers that our system was unworkable without government involved. And it didn't do anything about capacity, port, and supply chain issues. And it impacted Saskatchewan roads, as without short lines, trucks came and had to pick up the traffic. The quota law didn't deal with the capacity issues, and I'm going to get into that because there are capacity issues, and they all are related to the rate making that has haunted the industry over the years since the Crow rate. Since 2000, the rate making instrument is the revenue cap. Now, the revenue cap impacts things on two fronts. First, I'm going to deal with capacity in the revenue cap. Looking back over the years, has government efforts to manage the export movement of grain served Canadian producers well? Regulation of grain, marketing, and transportation have led, as I've said, to subsidies, investment deficits, efficiency losses, government involvement, government subsidies, and regulation under the revenue cap continues with these serious problems. So it was initially heralded as a step forward, not unlike the WGTA. In its time, it was said this was going to be progressive legislation. So was the revenue cap. But it's, the revenue cap is limiting investment, and it's limiting the ability to competitively move Canadian grains to export markets. Although the railways are investing back in the system and annually spend about $2 billion to improve the system, the revenue cap removes any incentive to move that grain efficiently. In any event, I have trouble with that word, that's for sure. Okay, and here's how, because the railway companies are going to ration the deliveries and ensure a steady monthly rate to ensure a fixed average, because what happens are that if the CTA, the Canadian Transportation Agency, finds the railway has overshot its maximum revenue entitlement, or it's over the revenue cap, you're going to pay a big fine, railway. And if it's under, that's money that was lost and is lost forever. So there's a real incentive to the railways to keep her steady as she goes. The second thing is incentives. Now, incentives can move a commercial system, but for the railways, don't put incentives in the system, because if you do, the money earned from one shipper, you're going to have to take it away from another, because there's the revenue cap. That is a maximum revenue entitlement. So you're only entitled to so much. So if you give someone an incentive, you're going to have to take it away from someone else. That's how the revenue cap works. Who's to blame? Who's to blame for this situation? Well, it's the Canadian governments that chose to deal with grain in this way. Railways follow what the law tells them to do. The grain was set up as an unimportant commodity. So here's some suggestions on what has to be done. The hopper cars. Between 1972 and 86, we all know around this room that the Government of Canada purchased about 14,000 hopper cars. When you add on governments, wheat board, etc., there were about 16,500. It's terribly difficult to get rid of these cars, and for the past 20 years, we've been trying to get rid of them, and nobody really quite knows what to do with them. The desperately wanted sale that was about to occur in about 2006 never took place. So now the CTA has been given oversight of car leases as the cars move into commercial position. There is a new fleet available, as we've spoken about here, and it could carry about 25% more grain. As the cars are shorter, they could provide, and what you would get is longer cars. You would get a more efficient movement of grain. You would create efficiencies, greater capacity at ports, railways, and the shipper would all benefit. But those rail cars cannot be purchased, and here's why. For one thing, the cost of them would be between $1 and $1.3 billion. A recent study said that if you look at that over a 10-year period, you're asking for a $100 million capital outlay by the railways. Now, that's just for the cars itself. I'm not talking about the more powerful locomotives that would be needed or the multi-car loading sites that would be required. Simply for the cars, you're asking railways to put out $100 million a year of capital. But the railways can't do that because the revenue cap doesn't give them any incentive to go and buy those assets. Why should they buy an asset when they're not going to get any credit for it under the revenue cap? There's a second reason why the railways cannot buy the hopper cars, and that's because you've created an environment where here we're talking about, should we have a productivity review? Should we have a running rights? Should we have all sorts of other intrusive powers like interswitching? And you're then asking an investor, make an investment in this really uncertain economic climate. Well, it just doesn't work that way. Another reason why you won't have investment, why railways cannot buy the cars is because under the Act, there's an incentive to lease the cars, not to buy the cars. So under the Act, and it's a 2008 law, a company or government that divests itself, as the Saskatchewan Grain Car Corporation did in 2011, it said, hey, no more free leases here, commercial rates between us. So the law says...
5 minutes.
Oh my gosh. So in any event, what happens then is that there's no incentive under that law for the railways to do anything but lease the cars. Similarly with surge capacity, I touched on it, that when in surge capacity you can't have railways providing crews, equipment, locomotives, so that for a certain weeks you need that. The revenue cap says everything must be stabilized, so you can't get that under the revenue cap. And as I say, the revenue cap says the saw-off is this: you get a low quality service and you get a low price. You do not, as one commentator said, get a white tablecloth at McDonald's. And that's how the system is set up. It must be changed. We must deregulate. We must get rid of the rate regulation, move into a commercial system. Competition and running rights, it's no different. Studies have come from the US saying that running rights doesn't work, and I'm hoping that here we can get some, I know that Terry Edgeworth, or White, I can't recall your last name for that, from Montana, his slides, I'm hoping he's going to give you the slide about the famous Christensen report that just got completed for the US Congress. It says running rights, thumbs down on running rights, and it analyzes railways and how they've, whether they're gouging or issues of this, and have said no, there's no such thing as that. As to the future, I'm suggesting we retain the Conference Board and the Christensen, let's look at the state of the industry. Let's stop lobbying and influence peddling and taking positions and being at odds with each other. Let's get somebody to give us a state of the industry health. And in closing, I'm going to quickly report from the Montreal Gazette in 1962, who reported on the McPherson recommendations that railways be treated like an ordinary business, that they be allowed to rise and fall according to managerial and technical ability. The reports, the Montreal Gazette in that editorial said as follows: the McPherson report may seem as revolutionary, but it is revolutionary only in the sense that it departs from the grotesque entanglements of past policies. Is it really revolutionary that a Royal Commission on Transportation should base its recommendations on the principles that the level of health attaching to an individual firm providing transportation service should reflect managerial and technical ability? It's urgently hoped that the report will be implemented. If so, Canada could have the most efficient transportation system in the world. A transportation system that's placed under the necessity of proving itself or failing is far better than a transportation system that's never given a chance to prove itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary-Jane, for that enlightening presentation on the railroad side of transportation issues. We have time for probably a couple of questions. Your name? Go ahead.
The reduction on your 30%, all you had to get rid of was between 2 and 8 cars. So if you distribute them through there, you can see how it works, and they don't have to maintain the cars then. Neighbor Seeds has collapsed again because they're not getting service. It seems like we're not even learning anything. Did you study the Surface Transport Board over the Russian market collapse?
I know that the Surface Transportation Board has taken positions. I know
No, I didn't ask that. I asked, did you study the report after the April 85 or whenever it was, and they had Burlington Northern had 39,000 cars, lumber cars, you name it. They had 56,000 grain orders. How could they accept that? There's no accountability. And their lease rates, if you'd have studied that, is 8.5%, and their cars are built so poorly that they'd be lucky if they could last 30 years. Our cars, we don't even know how long those 14,000 cars that you're talking about, we don't even know how long they will last. They won't last in the potash industry, but they certainly will last there.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up the potash industry, because the potash industry, we've got some things happening. BNSF, under a commercial system, has just bought a huge amount of hopper cars. In Canada, as I say, we can't. Campotex, the potash industry, has bought...
I don't think they bought them. I think they were leasing them.
Sir, don't interrupt her. Let her speak.
At the cost of $1.17 billion. And then we've got Campotex, a private industry. They just bought, at a cost of $500 million, 7,000 rail cars, boosting Hamilton's National Steel and their 2,400 employees. That's what deregulation can bring to the Canadian economy. Producers aside, and as Murad Al-Khatib has said, this is focusing on the economy. And containerization, for example, you can't move grain by containerization under the revenue cap because it's a more expensive move, and if you start doing more expensive moves, you're going to have to cut off somewhere else. So even though this is a growing trend, you can't do it under the revenue cap. You can do it, but you're going to have to cut back somewhere else because there's a cap on your revenue.
The single car efficiency of a 100-ton hopper
can you
car
wrap up quickly,
was
please?
1.68. When they loaded them on the main line to full capacity, 110, that jumped up to 1.86, which is equivalent to coal. So what is the single car efficiency of your new 25% improved grain car?
Thank you, sir.
What is it?
What is the...
Single car efficiency of that. For instance, single-decked container cars compared to a 65-ton boxcar, which is 1.44, is 0.78. Double stacked, it's 1.43. Aluminum car was 1.43. I mean, you got to talk about efficiencies in a likable manner. If you're going to still supply 45-foot cars in a 100-car train, you've got 8 leaks at every joint, potential for 8 leaks. Pumping more air through solves nothing. You standing us up there and telling us all these figures is nothing, meaningless.
Thank you, sir. Next, Mike Norm, please.
I'm not sure what the question was, so. But in any event.
Norm Hall, APAS. I picked out a couple of mistakes that you've made. One, you said that the MRE only allows for lease of cars. It allows for investment of anything, because any grain-related purchases are depreciated at the percentage that the investment is for grain. So grain, any purchases of grain cars, 100% depreciable, so 100% of those costs go into the MRE.
I'm saying that what the revenue cap or the MRE says is that, first of all, you've got a climate that doesn't, where you're going to have a very shaky investor at best. Second of all, because you're here asking for running rights. You're here asking for an intrusive year-long costing review. And then you're saying to investors, but invest in the system. But, you know, things may change in a year. So that means that it's going to be very difficult for a good investment climate, because what an investor wants is a good steady rate of return. And studies done in the U.S. for U.S. Congress said 30 to 50 years. I want to look forward 30 to 50 years and make sure that my infrastructure investment maintains itself at that time. Secondly, under the 2008 law, the fact of the matter is that that money, the law says that once you've got those railway cars that are out there, so if you've got the wheat board, for example, it says no more leases, they're going to be commercial from now on. The railways get a benefit from that. So why would they buy when you can move to the lease cars rather than the purchase of the cars? And I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And then you've got $100 million. They're supposed to put this money out and benefit you when there is no return for them, nothing. That doesn't make business sense.
How do you mean there's no return?
Well,
they get the MRE payment for
yes,
the use
they get
of them.
the MRE payment.
And if those cars go south into the U.S. or to Thunder Bay or domestic deliveries, they get to charge full rate on those as well. So don't say that there's no return on investment into the grain system.
The MRE says what you're saying is the MRE is at X amount for railways. Buy rail cars at $1.3 billion, but that's not going to change this at all. It's going to stay straight there. So why would you buy the rail cars? Well, you should read the report by Dr. Barry Prentice, who this is where this is coming from, and Dr. Gordon Edsworth, their recent report. You may want to read it to put yourself up to date on those issues. That's what they say, and they say it's a serious problem.
I've talked with the CTA directly, and they've given their interpretation of the law and how they're putting it forward. And also, the MRE was the idea of the railroads back in '99. It didn't come from anybody else, and it was their response to the threat of common running rights.
Well, I'm afraid you haven't read the 2000 Kroger report where the railways said, give us a commercial system and we will promise you your rates won't move for X number of years. I'm sorry, I can't recall what it was, but that's not what producers wanted. They wanted the MRE when it came to the Kruger stage.
I'll take one last question from the mic on my right here.
Go ahead, Lyndon.
Right here.
Am I on the right? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary-Jane, for your presentation. I'm Lyndon Lisitza from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. And I guess one question I have for you and a couple comments, but in your presentation, you indicate that the regulation that occurred during 2014 took away service from short lines, the oat growers, different commodity groups. And I guess the question I have for you is do you believe that railway capacity should be a zero-sum game? Whereas if you're given to one, you're taken from someone else? Because I think really what the industry is asking for is to get out from under the railway monopoly mindset and of restricting quantity of service and build the supply chain capacity towards the future sustained growth of the industry itself. And so I guess the question for you is, should it be a zero-sum game, or should the railways be focused on improving capacity for the entire system moving forward?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question exactly. What I'm saying is the railways are as interested as producers. There's a partnership of sorts between the two, and that partnership is railways want an efficient supply chain as much as a producer does. But what it is when you've got a revenue cap, it doesn't allow for that because it says move things at the same speed, because if you move or not move at the same speed, move at the same weekly volume, because if you move up and down, you're going to interfere with revenue cap, the maximum revenue entitlement. I'm maybe not making myself as clear as I'd hoped, but...
What I'm trying to say is, why is it that the railways will give to someone that has to take away from someone else? Wouldn't the goal be to build that capacity within the system? And I'm not sure if the revenue cap is preventing that.
I think we're on the same page here. Exactly. Why would you have to give from one to take away from another? My answer is deregulate. You'll see. You'll have a much better system. Because even the revenue cap itself doesn't, as I say, incentives aren't built into the revenue cap. Because if you give an incentive to one, you're going to have to take it away from another. The regulation, you are quite right, is causing the problem.
In terms of the revenue cap, I would argue differently, saying that the incentive to become more efficient and reduce your operating costs with the possibility of increasing profit is incentive enough.
I'm going to have to cut this off. We're 5 minutes past our noon break. Let's thank Mary-Jane.
Thank you. Thank you.